James Holloway pressed his fingers against the cold glass display case, staring at the faded photograph of soldiers standing beside a burned village. The Imperial War Museum archives smelled of old paper and secrets. Everything changed 3 months ago when his grandmother died and left him a leather journal hidden in her attic. The journal belonged to his grandfather, Lieutenant Richard Holloway. James had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's heroism, medals displayed proudly in the family home. But the journal told a different story. Page after page detailed civilian massacres, villages burned without military justification, prisoners executed rather than processed. James had spent weeks cross-referencing the journal entries with declassified military records. Every incident his grandfather described was real, documented in sterile military language. The curator approached with a box of documents. Inside were testimonies from Burmese villagers collected by a forgotten UN investigation team in 1947. Reading through the testimonies, he felt his stomach tighten. A woman described watching soldiers set fire to homes with families still inside. These were not the random casualties of war his textbooks described. These were deliberate acts of terror. His phone buzzed with a message about his upcoming lecture. James had given this lecture dozens of times, always presenting the Allies as morally superior. He could no longer teach that narrative with honesty. That evening, James sat in his office. He began rewriting his lecture. He would tell his students about his grandfather. He would show them the journal entries. The brutal past was not just about enemies we defeated. Sometimes it lived in our own family trees. Nadia Foster adjusted her camera lens, focusing on the weathered hands of the woman sitting across from her. 89-year-old Ruth Bergman had survived 3 concentration camps. Her apartment in Berlin was modest, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren who existed because she had endured the unendurable. Nadia had been filming her documentary for 8 months, traveling across Europe to interview the remaining survivors. Each conversation left her changed. Ruth began speaking in a quiet voice that carried the weight of decades. She described arriving at Auschwitz at age 15, the selection process that sent her mother and younger brother immediately to the gas chambers while she was deemed fit for labor. She spoke without tears, having cried all she could cry decades ago. The documentary project had started as Nadia's master's thesis, but transformed into something deeper. She was the granddaughter of a Wehrmacht soldier, a fact that sat like a stone in her chest during every interview. Her grandfather had died before she was born, leaving behind only a few letters and a photograph in uniform. Her family never spoke about what he had done during the war. They preferred the comfortable ambiguity of not knowing. After finishing with Ruth, Nadia drove to Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp north of Berlin that had been partially preserved as a memorial. She walked through the grounds where over 200,000 people had been imprisoned. The brick buildings stood as silent witnesses. Tour groups moved through with audio guides, snapping photos at designated spots. Nadia wondered how many truly grasped what had happened here. She set up her camera near the execution trench where thousands had been shot. Speaking directly to the lens, she recorded her own testimony for the first time. She told the story of discovering her grandfather's letters in her father's basement 2 years ago. Most were mundane, discussing food shortages and weather. But 3 letters mentioned his posting at a camp in Poland. He never named which camp, never described his duties, but he wrote about the smoke and the smell that never left his uniform. Her father had been furious when she told him about the documentary project. He accused her of betraying the family, dredging up shame that should remain buried. Her mother stopped returning her calls. They wanted to believe the comfortable lie that their family had been uninvolved, perhaps even secretly opposed to the regime. Nadia could no longer afford that luxury. The next interview took her to Munich, where she met Jakob Stein, whose parents had both perished in Dachau. He was 73, born in a displaced persons camp after liberation. His entire understanding of his parents came from testimonies of other survivors and a single photograph. Jakob showed her the picture of a young couple, smiling before the world collapsed around them. Jakob spoke about the children of perpetrators who contacted him over the years, seeking forgiveness or understanding. Some genuinely wanted to confront their family histories. Others wanted absolution they had not earned. Nadia asked which category she fell into. Jakob studied her face for a long moment before responding that the question itself suggested she might be different. That night in her hotel room, Nadia reviewed the footage. Dozens of faces filled her screen, each carrying stories of unimaginable brutality survived. She thought about her grandfather, about the family who would never forgive her for this project. The brutal past demanded more than remembrance. It demanded that descendants of perpetrators speak the truth, even when it destroyed family myths. Especially then. Thomas Wei stood in the rain outside the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, watching school groups file through the entrance. At 26, he had visited this place 17 times, each visit revealing connections between historical atrocities and modern injustices that most people refused to see. His notebook was filled with observations, questions that made his professors uncomfortable, patterns that linked 1937 to the present day. Inside the memorial, photographs documented the systematic murder of over 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war by Japanese forces. Thomas moved slowly through the exhibits, studying the faces of victims frozen in their final moments. These were not abstract statistics. Each represented a life interrupted, a family destroyed, futures erased. His own great-grandmother had survived the massacre by hiding in a cellar for 6 weeks, emerging to find her entire neighborhood reduced to corpses and ash. Thomas had grown up hearing her stories, though she rarely spoke about the worst details. She described the silence that fell over the city after the killing stopped, broken only by dogs and crows. She talked about the years afterward, how survivors were expected to simply rebuild and forget, how speaking about the trauma was considered dwelling in the past. She died 3 years ago, and Thomas inherited her journals written in fading ink on brittle paper. His activism began after reading those journals. Thomas started documenting modern instances of state violence, drawing explicit parallels between historical massacres and contemporary abuses. His blog posts compared the dehumanization tactics used in 1937 Nanjing to current treatment of Uyghur populations in Xinjiang. He analyzed how perpetrator nations minimize or deny atrocities. The comparisons made him enemies on multiple sides. Nationalists accused him of betraying China by criticizing current government actions. Others claimed he was disrespecting massacre victims by politicizing their suffering. Thomas believed the opposite. Honoring the dead meant ensuring such brutality never happened again, which required calling it out wherever it emerged. His phone buzzed with messages from fellow activists planning a vigil for the anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown. The government had already detained 2 organizers. Thomas knew attending meant risking arrest, potentially losing his university position. Maybe worse. He thought about his great-grandmother hiding in that cellar, about the choice between silence and survival. That evening, Thomas met his former professor, Dr. Lin, at a tea house far from campus. Dr. Lin had mentored him through his undergraduate years, encouraging his critical thinking until it became too critical. The older man looked tired, worn down by decades of academic compromises. He urged Thomas to be more cautious, to express his ideas with more subtlety, to remember that one person could not change entrenched systems. Thomas listened respectfully, but disagreed completely. The brutal past was not sealed away in memorials and museums. It was alive in every instance of state violence, every silenced dissent, every truth labeled too dangerous to speak. He pulled out his laptop and showed Dr. Lin his latest article connecting historical patterns of state violence across different nations and time periods. The piece documented how governments use nearly identical propaganda techniques to justify atrocities. Finally, the professor closed the laptop and met Thomas's eyes. He spoke quietly about his own father, imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution for teaching banned literature, about choices made under pressure, about the luxury of idealism when you had nothing to lose. Then he surprised Thomas by asking for the article file. He knew a journalist in Taiwan who might publish it beyond the reach of censors. Thomas walked home through streets that had once run with blood, now filled with neon signs and rushing commuters. The past and present were not separate. Every injustice ignored today became tomorrow's historical atrocity. Every person who spoke truth created cracks in systems built on silence. His great-grandmother survived to bear witness. He would carry that witness forward, connecting past brutality to present responsibility, refusing to let comfortable amnesia sever the unbroken chain between what was and what is.